Welcome to a new video for the channel. I'm still a little bit ill. I just realized that I wasn't recording, so we're just redoing this intro again. So I'm very happy to have Jeremy as a new guest to the channel. How are you doing, Jeremy?
I'm doing fine, thank you.
We met when I did a Tiny Tapeout workshop in Bristol, and Jeremy was one of the few people there that had already had a lot of chip design experience, which is unusual for a Tiny Tapeout workshop because most people, when you ask them the question, have they done chip design stuff before? Most people say no. But you've had a lot of experience. So why don't you tell us a little bit about your ASIC experience, Jeremy?
Okay, well, my first job was for a company in the UK called Inmos that was founded in the end of the 1970s by the Labour government and then continued for a bit before the Tories flogged it off to somebody else. And it was founded to create a rival to Silicon Valley in the UK, which it wasn't 100% successful at, but well, not the way they intended it to be anyway.
Inmos was quite impactful, though, wasn't it?
Oh yes, absolutely. But it mostly because lots of people left it and founded other things, which in fact is the way Silicon Valley started.
Yeah.
But I don't think that's the way the government envisaged it. Yes, in the early 1980s, it was the world leader in high-speed DRAM and SRAM. And on the back of that, it developed the transputer, which was a parallel processor designed to have thousands of them communicating together, or lots of them communicating together. And there were some supercomputers made out of transputers, and all sorts of fun demos and things done with it. But it had its limitations, so it got soon overtaken by other things. But as I say, out of that have grown all sorts of much more successful operations and lots of startups. And the number of startups in Bristol, you'll find that all the people involved, all the founders and stuff, are ex-Inmos people. So Inmos did start at Silicon Valley; it just didn't succeed in itself. So when I was there, I was in the graphics division. So we developed the color lookup tables. So in the mid 1980s, the first IBM PCs came out. What put their colors on the screen were Inmos color lookup tables. So the whole of VGA, every VGA device initially coming out, an IBM PC had an Inmos color lookup table in it. And for, I guess, best part of a decade, that was a very major revenue stream. Although I think they started at about $100 a chip, and by the end they were down at about 50 cents a chip. Because there were so many other people who were sort of copying and rivaling in it and stuff. So I joined in 1988. Which was about 3 or 4 years into that. And we started doing the successor devices for, to try and sort of, keep the revenue up, because we saw the price where the price was going. So we wanted to do faster, more sophisticated things, moving away from 8-bit RAM DACs to 16-bit, 24-bit color, all sorts of things like that. And towards the tail end of that, we had a partnership with NVIDIA, which at the time was a brand new startup. I think at the time we first engaged with them, they had about 10 employees.
Wow.
Something like that.
Early days of NVIDIA.
Very, very early days. And they needed, they'd come out of... basically out of Sun Microsystems. They were the graphics team out of Sun Micro. And they wanted to design new graphics chips, but they realized that they'd have to have phase lock loops and the color lookup tables and various other bits and pieces, which they didn't know how to do any of that stuff. They just did the drawing shapes side of things, and not any of the other bits. So
Right.
they needed a partner, and ST, who we were at that time, had both the sort of the fab capabilities and through us the phase lock loops and the other bits and pieces they needed. So we did, I think, 3 versions of their chip. First version was a Sea of Gates implementation of their first chip, which was actually a lot more sophisticated than the first one that was actually commercially successful. It was just rather didn't fit in with Microsoft's view of the way that color graphics should be done, shall we say.
Right.
So it got cursed effectively, but it was very good. It did sort of natively did curved textures and things like that. Back in oh god, what was that, 1994? It was doing sort of really, really sophisticated stuff. But they then moved on to what was their first commercially successful one with us, which was the called the Riva 128. And the way that they designed most of the circuitry, not all of it, we did the RAM-DAC side of things, did all the place and route, physical implementation, testability, all that sort of stuff. I did the CAD flow. I personally did most of the place and route, and designed the video scaler in it. So it was sort of a two-handed operation. Some of it being done by the NVIDIA team, some of it being done by us.
Yeah. So that's like all goes to say that you know what you're doing.
Yes. Yes. Yeah.
So, yes, like after a while of kind of being involved with the Tiny Tapeout stuff, you volunteered some time to help out, which is extremely appreciated. I'll thank you again publicly. And just just to say that one of the first things that you did was you reviewed all of the terminology pages on my website and made a whole load of pull requests. So that was really appreciated. And then the second thing that you've been working on is helping to make sure that Tiny Tapeout doesn't have timing issues, and being involved in checking the Scanchain stuff, but also you're really involved in the design and the discussion of the new multiplexer, which is going to eliminate the Scanchain and vastly improve the speed of things. So that's really what we're here to talk about today. So maybe it's just worth mentioning that when Sylvain Monod implemented the Scanchain for Tiny Tapeout, we were already worried about the top level timing, because it's still not like 100% clear or like detailed on how to handle this. But essentially, you can harden a block with OpenLane, and the timing is going to work out. But as soon as you've got 2 blocks, there's not really much in the way of automatic tools to help you validate the timing between those 2 blocks. So you either have to build that yourself, or you have to kind of design defensively by constraining the timing with SDC files, and then post layout, do the extraction, do the what's it called when you extract the parasitics of the wiring, and then you do back annotation.
Mm-hmm.
Then you run STA, and you make sure that everything's going to work again. And all of that stuff is still a bit beyond me, but that was all like totally within your wheelhouse. So that's really what you've been helping out with, and what we're here to talk about today. So we already knew that the tools had this limitation, and Sylvain used this trick where you get a lot more hold time margin by using a negative edge flip-flop on the output of each block in the Tiny Tapeout chain, so that the data is changing in the middle of the clock period, not on the edge or close to the edge. And it's got a kind of an interesting side effect, which is if you do have any problems with hold, you can slow the clock down, and that does fix hold violations in that case when you're doing the negative edge triggered flip flops on the end. Is there anything else you want to add to that?
Yeah, I mean right. So the issue is ultimately that well, there's quite a lot of issues. One is, as you say, the OpenLane flow is designed for creating the whole design in one go.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not really designed at assembling things. So there needed to be a certain amount of scripting or extra structure put around it to be able to do any form of analysis above that. So we can talk about how I've solved that. In terms of from the design point of view, the problem is that the clock distribution is the way the clock distribution is done is just it flows through the scan chain, whereas on a normal ASIC you would have a more formally distributed clock tree.
Yeah.
With a global spec for the overall skew from the root of the tree to the twigs, and maximum skews between the twigs. So you'd synthesize a clock tree so to say that no matter what two twigs were being considered, they were no more than a nanosecond apart in when they fire, which means that as long as you have got the right characteristics in your flip-flops, then there should be no race condition when one block talks to another.
Yeah,
that's not what we've got. What we've got is a data flowing with clock sort of system.
Yeah,
which is in this case is okay because you don't have arbitrary communication between the blocks. It's only the block talking to its adjacent part of the scan chain, and then one part of the scan chain talking to the immediately next part of the scan chain.
Yeah.
So you don't have the sort of what happens if the bottom left block talks to the top right block, which is the reason why you would need a more formal system.
I guess the other thing to note here is that we are kind of making it a little bit hard for ourselves with Tiny Tapeout, because if we just fetched all the source files for all the designs and then made it into one huge design, flattened it and hardened it into like one block, then everything would be a lot smaller because we would get much higher density, but also we would have like a clock tree that would feed everything correctly. But kind of one of the things that like the reason that I'm kind of deliberately making it harder for ourselves is because I want for people to have like that little ownership of that little block, which is theirs.
The other thing is that you wouldn't have you potentially you end up with very strange situations when you do that sort of flattening. So you might end up with a design that had very slack timing requirements just spread all over the chip. So it wouldn't be that this little blob is design A and this little blob is design B. Design A could be an intense little blob because it had tight timing, and design B could be spread all over the universe. That would require a certain amount more larger faith in the tool chain and in the designs that design A and design B weren't going to interfere with each other. So actually, I don't have too much of a problem with having hierarchy in the design to separate these things out, so that function A is in a given place. It's just that you then need to make the tools cope with it.
So maybe we can move the conversation along to you'd agreed to because we've decided to stick with the same Scanchain layout for Tiny Tapeout 3 because I didn't feel there was enough time to do the mux in a quickly and safely.
Mm-hmm.
So I thought, well, now that you're more involved and you're volunteering and you're helping out with the timing stuff, why don't we do? Let's just double check that everything is good with Tiny Tapeout 2, because we'd kind of we'd designed it, like as I mentioned, defensively, so that we could always resolve hold violations by slowing things down. Do you want to tell us what you discovered when you did that analysis?
Right. Okay. So the plus point of the scheme with the having the last block with the negative edge, as you say, is that you don't have as critical an issue with skew. Whereas, if everything was positive edged and you had skew, then the thing could potentially just be dead.
And that's really my number one thing to avoid.
Yes, you don't want that. Plus, actually diagnosing that that's the reason why it's dead is potentially difficult, because you will see sort of stuttering functionality out of something. It looks like stuff is happening, but it's all sort of not really in quite the right order, or whatever, but the disadvantage of going to using both edges is that you're now suddenly sensitive to both edges. Whereas normally on if you're just using rising edge flip flops, it's only the front edge that matters as you go along. So you can actually have quite a distorted clock with a very small pulse, and it would still work. Whereas if you're using both edges, you're now sensitive to the pulse size, which of course you can solve by slowing the clock down, but you might have to slow it down a lot. So the exercise that I did was twofold. So the first one was to get top level timing analysis working, and basically that's just as I say, patching around the issues with the tools. So we needed to make the OpenSDA engine able to read the whole design, which is made up of lots of sub-designs and all the parasitics and some top-level timing constraints, and cope with it. The barriers to that were it doesn't understand the Verilog include mechanism at all. So you have to have just one piece of Verilog, has to have everything in it. It doesn't have to be flattened. It just has to have all the modules defined in it.
In one file.
And I think probably in the right order. So I wrote a Python script that does the hash including effectively. The other thing is you need to then apply the right parasitics to the right blocks. And fortunately, there is a mechanism within the STA tool by which you can say, okay, put this spef parasitic file in that path of the design. So that then just comes down to effectively writing a script that goes, for this instance, load that spef file, for this instance, load. So that was easy enough.
Yeah. So when you make user project wrapper as the kind of final thing inside Caravel, you end up with the GDS, but you also end up with the spef. So is that the spef that you use that has all the information about the timing between all the blocks?
Right. So so there's a spef for the inside of every block.
Yeah.
So in this case, 250 different spefs.
Blocks. Yeah.
And there's a top level spef, which is the wiring between.
Yeah.
So
that's the critical one to pay attention to, isn't it?
Yes, but we load all of those because obviously quite a lot of nets have bits that are in both. Yes, we assemble all of that lot. And then we do a check within the tool to ask it, are there any nets which we haven't annotated? Because that's a good way of picking up if we've missed something or done something stupid. And it's a small handful, and when you look at them, they're nets which are only outputs and not inputs. So, they're not going anywhere. So they probably actually haven't got a wire. So those are okay. So the sort of sanity checks you want to do. So doing that, then you run the SDA effectively in a similar way to what's done in the OpenLane flow, but we're using OpenSDA externally so that we've got complete control over what it's doing. And we can set the constraints and stuff ourselves rather than them being sort of implicitly set up by the flow. And that shows up where the critical hold and setup issues are, and they are basically at the end of the scan chain as it goes back into the scan controller. But because of the scheme, you can fix them just by slowing down, but potentially you have to slow down by quite a lot. Now, the issue then is how much do you believe the number that you get out of the timing analysis? And when you look at it, the timing report, in a normal case and in like the user's block cases, the clock tree would be a couple of layers deep. And normally on an ASIC, you'd expect a clock tree to be, I don't know, of an ASIC of this size, you'd expect the clock tree to be, say, 5 or 10 buffers deep at most. In which case you're not...
So just a clarification, when you say deep, it's like every time the clock tree diverges and branches out, that's like 5 layers of depth.
5 levels deep. So at most, the given clock edge from the source to you, to the flop, is say going through 5 buffers. And to any other twig, it might be 5 buffers. So the amount of skew between them due to the buffers is low. In the case of Tiny Tapeout, it's 250 buffers. Or I think, in fact, in Tiny Tapeout 2's scheme, it's 500 buffers because it's 2 buffers at each stage.
A pair in there,
So there's an awful lot of propagation going on in there. And so there's a lot of places where the approximations that have taken place in the characterization of the cells and in the way that STA calculates the delay that is due to that, you have an awful lot of that building up. So by the time you get to the end, it may be accurate in terms of saying, well, this is where an error, a case will be, but in terms of it saying how fast the thing will run, you're going to have to use a fairly big pinch of salt. So in particular, one of the things that is a fundamental assumption, effectively, of the way that static timing works is effectively you assume that all the logic cells have a common logic threshold. There's a common voltage at which they agree that 0 becomes 1. But in fact, in reality, every cell will have a different place where its logic threshold is. This will, in reality, vary with process corner and voltage and temperature and where that instance is on the chip and so on and so forth. So in reality, it's quite different from this sort of everything's got an ideal 50% of VDD.
That's why when you run STA, you run it on lots of corners, though, right?
Well, STA normally actually, it just really normally thinks, certainly in the OpenLane flow, it's thinking about 2 corners. It's talking about, it's for the hold time checks, it's checking at the fastest corner. And for the setup checks, it's checking at the slowest corner. You can run checks at particular corners. if you want to. But again, that still doesn't necessarily mean that you're seeing reality. You're just seeing more of the, potentially seeing more of the issues, but you won't necessarily see it to a circuit simulation level of accuracy.
Right.
So having used STA to identify the potential issues, what I then did was wrote another script that enabled me to write out a SPICE circuit that represented the critical path.
Yeah. Yeah. Do you want to show some pictures then?
Okay, so where are we? So this is the output of SPICE. The red line is the input clock to the beginning of this 250 or 500 in this case buffer chain. With, I mean, the edge rates might be sharper than that in reality. That's just what I set on the simulation. And the blue line is the output clock at the far end of the chain.
Yeah.
And as you can see, the pulse has got quite a lot wider by the time you get up there. So if this was a 50-50 mark space ratio clock rather than just a single pulse, so our next rising edge would be there.
Yeah.
Okay, and so on. If we look at the blue line, we'd be squeezing the zero time quite heavily.
Yeah.
So
we're also sensitive to the negative edge, like you said.
Yes. So we wouldn't have much time in here between this and the next rising edge.
Yeah.
So there's some activity that's happening rising edge to falling edge, and there's some activity which is happening falling edge to the next rising edge, and that part has got squeezed.
Is going to get run out of time.
It's going to run out of time. So
and eventually,
fortunately, you can get it back by slowing the clock down.
Slowing the clock, yeah.
But it's potentially a problem. Now, this is a typical. That's not the worst case. The worst case, I think, was this one.
Right.
Was that actually? No, that one's okay. No, wait a second. I'm trying to. I did so many sims. That one there. So that's the worst case one. So you look at the relative width of those two pulses.
Yeah. It's like twice as wide.
Yeah, at least twice as wide. So then if this is your actual clock and it's 50-50, then at the end you just have like a solid on pulse. You don't even have any negative edges anymore. Yes, yeah. Or you get a glitch or whatever. It just wouldn't propagate very well.
Yeah.
So the good news is they're nice sharp pulses. But the bad news is that you're having to, in this case, slow the clock down quite considerably to be able to cope.
Yeah. But the good news is you can slow the clock down and it will keep working.
Yes, absolutely. But the indication from this was that we were looking at probably sub 30 megahertz clocks or something like that to be able to get it working because of this. And this might still be being optimistic from some points of view.
So, and just to make it clear that to anyone watching, because we've got this, because we're doing everything serially. If we've got 250 designs and they've all got 8 inputs, then that 30 megahertz maximum clock gets divided down by a lot, so the actual update rate of your IOs is very low. So we were hoping to like hit around 15 kilohertz, but it's looking to be around more like 5 or 6 kilohertz now. So that's kind of is a bit disappointing in one way. I'm very happy that it will still work anyway.
Yes. So let's now look at a possible alternative.
Yes. So there was a suggestion from Sylvain, wasn't there?
So I haven't got all of the variants, but this is the equivalent clock using a slightly different scheme. So this is at the same skewed corner. And you'll notice that, for one thing, the propagation delay is lower.
Yeah.
So the pulses are closer together, and the width of the pulses is the same.
Same. Yeah.
And pretty well around all of the skew corners. We actually ran the extreme skews and the typicals and the slowest and fastest and stuff. On all of the corners, the pulse width stayed the same. The only thing that happens is that the delay of the blue pulse versus the red pulse gets longer. But but that doesn't affect the speed, really. That would just affect the absolute time between the rising edge of the input clock and when the output finally rippled out would vary a bit, but the frequency of it changing would not.
So how does this?
So how this scheme works? So the problem with the original Tiny Tapeout 2 scheme is that every critical edge was related to the rising edge of the clock all the way down the chain, which means that if you have just buffers all the way down the chain, that if the pull up time was not 100% the same as the pull down time, that your pulse will gradually get distorted as it goes down. So if the P transistors were slightly weaker than the N transistors, every rising edge would be slightly slow, and every falling edge would be fast. And this would gradually mean that the pulse will get slower and slower and slower, distorted as you go down the chain. And this is likely to happen at least one process corner, because even if, in this case, we're using the clock buffer cells, which have a closer to 1-to-1 drive ratio for the P and N than the normal synthesized buffers. The normal synthesized buffers are designed for effectively compactness of layout. So the P's will tend to be somewhat smaller than they would need to be to get that 50-50 ratio. But the clock buffers are nearer to that, but they're only nearer to that at the typical conditions. If you have at the slow skew corner, so the weak P, strong N, then you still have a slower rise time and faster fall time, and conversely on the opposite skew corner, you have you might be closer to the 1-to-1.
And any small issue that we have is going to be multiplied up by 250 or 500 times.
Yes, yeah. So it just really accumulates. So in this case, what we're doing is actually deliberately inverting the clock on every stage as we go along.
Okay.
So instead of buffering it, we are inverting it at every stage. And this has two advantages. One, instead of us having two buffers in every block, we have one inverter. And the second is that it has the effect of the critical edge is toggling as you go each way along at each stage along the chain. And if it's slow pulling up in this block, then that will slow down the leading edge, but in the next block it's slowing down the trailing edge.
Oh, that's nice. So it cancels itself out.
So it cancels itself out.
Yeah, awesome. So this is a suggestion for an improvement we can make with Tiny Tapeout 3, right? Because we've got the
yes, and it's theoretically a small change.
Yes, it's something that I'd be willing to consider.
Yes, Although all we have been looking at here is the timing characteristics. What we haven't looked at is the functionality. So what we haven't checked that the controller gets things out at the right time or does the right number of ticks, which might be slightly more complicated. How many ticks do I have to do to get the data I want to the right block? Might be slightly complicated. That side I haven't thought about. That's more than
Sylvan's ballpark.
Sylvan's wheelhouse. This was more looking at how do we do the top level analysis and what are the extra issues.
The other thing that Sylvan suggested, which we kind of tried out a bit with your SDA tool. Was there another picture you wanted to show?
No.
So another thing that Sylvan was suggesting, which we tried out with your STA tool, was to basically look at what happens. So because we feed that, we get access to that clock as it comes out, because the default scan controller is external. We don't even use that internal controller by default. It's set up so that if everything goes wrong with the pad frame and the RISC-V processor and everything, it's still going to work. So we can put a clock in and we can measure it out on a scope and we can see how that changes. And then if it gets like a smaller width, then we can, instead of putting a 50-50 clock in, we can put a different waveform in instead, so that that pulse never disappears. And in that way, we can ramp up the frequency a little bit more.
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, it will help the practicality of distorting the input waveform. It all depends on how you're doing it. Certainly out of a microcontroller, I think you might have difficulty delivering a greater than 30 megahertz clock with a controlled pulse rate. Or width. I think you find that difficult. An FPGA, you'd be able to do it, but that feels like a little bit like a very large hammer to crack a nut. But the inverting scheme solves it. And from what I could see from the STA, if I employed that inverting scheme in the STA, it goes from running at something like a 30 megahertz shift rate to closer to a 200 megahertz shift rate.
Yeah, which is what we planned.
Yeah. So if we can make that change, and that would seem like a very sensible and cheap way of getting a lot more performance.
Yeah. So that's where we're at. That's the update. So thanks so much for looking at that for me. I've been looking at your script, and that's about to be added to the GitHub actions on Tiny Tapeout 3. So that we can like have this STA analysis run along with all the other verification that we do on the project. So if anyone out there is interested in looking at Jeremy's work, it's all going to be pushed to the GitHub repository soon. So we may make this small change for Tiny Tapeout 3, which will improve the performance. But because we're longer term, we're going to be switching to this MUX idea, which is going to completely get rid of the Scanchain. I don't want to spend too much time and energy on it, and especially I don't want to risk something going wrong. Is there anything else you want to add, Jeremy?
No, I think that's it.
Right. So thanks again for your time. I really appreciate it, and we'll probably get you back on for a chat about the MUX stuff when we're a bit closer to running the timing analysis on the MUX. Because I think one of the other cool things about the MUX is we're going to be able to have a bit more of a definitive answer about the timing, because it won't be going through so like this 500 blocks will be able to be much more.
I'd have a little bit more faith in the modeling, or at least if it said it ran at 100 megahertz, we'd know it was that plus or minus 10%. Whereas,
Yeah.
you know,
Yeah.
the Scanchain, I think it's a little bit more of a guess.
Yes. Okay. Well, thanks a lot for your time,
Great.
Jeremy, and I'll see you around.
Great. Thank you.
So
Bye bye.